E olha só, hein, estamos ao vivo mais uma vez aqui na nossa querida idolatrada sensacional Fique em Casa, Conf. E, mano, hoje com a presença sensacional, mano, olha, eu vou te falar, essa conferência está ficando cada vez mais incrível. Hoje nós temos o sensacional Dan, mano, olha só que sensacional. Man, for us is a big pleasure to have you here speaking to us, buddy. Thank you for accepting the invite, man. Thank you.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here. C'est un grand plaisir, en fait. Ouais.
Oh, so nice, man. So for people that had not the opportunity to know about you or what your amazing talks is, really, it's amazing talks. Could you speak a little about you or and your experience for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. So, hi everybody. My name is Dan. I am in developer relations at Datadog. So, what's Datadog? We're a observability company. Super. I do developer relations over there. So, a big part of what I do is stuff like this. Is just getting out and talking with people and getting people excited about things and just sharing knowledge and telling good stories and hopefully making connections with people in this strange and uncertain time that we're living in right now. Making those connections and sharing experiences with people is more important like now than ever, right? So again, I'm just super happy that you invited me, and I'm excited to get going.
So nice, man. Great. So everyone knows that we are living a special moment in our history, I believe. And everyone also knows of the importance to stay at home, right? So if you can, stay at home. We have a big challenge forward, and we need to stay calm, healthy, fine, and if possible, at home, right? So let's start. Today, we invited this amazing guy to share a little bit of his knowledge with us and give to everybody one more reason to stay at Rome today. So, I hope that you enjoyed this time and feel free to return here more times. Feel at home, literally, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, with you, Dan.
Well, thank you so much. That's maybe one of the most impressive introductions that I've ever had. So thank you so much for that. I'm feeling very blessed right now. Thank you so much.
Enjoy, man.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So, hi. Olá. Meu nome é Dan, sou francês, mas cresci no Canadá. Eu falo um pouco de português, mas não suficiente para fazer uma apresentação. Donc, por isso, vou continuar em inglês. O francês? Nah, English. So we'll go ahead in English. It'll probably be a bit better for everybody. So what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to be talking about a bunch of acronyms, basically, right? So a series of acronyms, SLIs, SLOs, SLAs, and a bunch of stuff that kind of goes around these acronyms. These things are something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and working on and developing technology around and best practices around at Datadog. And I've never delivered this talk before, so I'm excited to be doing it for the first time for the audience here today. All right, so what are we going to be covering over the next, well, actually, I don't know how long it'll take. Let's say 30 minutes. It is Friday, so I'm not going to keep everybody. I know Gomex yesterday, he did a marathon session, 2 hours, which is incredible. I will not be doing 2 hours. So what are we going to be covering today? Again, a bunch of acronyms. We're going to talk about what those are, what they define, kind of the idea there of what they mean. We're going to talk about something called quality targets. Quality targets. And you need to understand what those acronyms mean before we can talk about that. So we see that we're building up to something here. We're going to talk about error budgets. Budgets, obviously super important in everyday life, in your personal life, in your professional life. And as it turns out, computers too. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to wrap up with some practical examples, basically, of all of these things that have been taken from our experiences at Datadog, where we've made, frankly, a number of fairly large mistakes over the years, and I would like to help you avoid making those same mistakes. So that's what we're going to be going through today. So let's start at the start, right, with these acronyms. Technical people love acronyms, right? And in this case, we've got 3 that are almost the same, and they're easy to mix up. So let's just take them step by step. We'll start with some nice tidy definitions and make sure that everybody feels comfortable with what these things are and mean, because they form the basis not only for the rest of this talk, but also just for a lot of other interesting things up to and including like SRE and product management and all sorts of good stuff like that, as we're going to see a little bit later on. So we'll start with SLIs on purpose, right? This is not random. What is an SLI? Okay, SLI stands for service level indicator. And what's that? A service level indicator is a quantitative measurement that expresses an aspect of the service or a service. This is commonly expressed as a metric. Now, when I am helping my fellow coworkers to develop their talks, I say, never read what's on the slide. That's a big no-no. But because I get to make the rules, I also get to break them. So that's why I read what's on the slide. The reason that I read it is because the words here are very, very carefully selected. Okay? That last part especially is important. All right? It's commonly a metric. It's commonly a number. We talk about SLIs, we're talking about numbers. Now, it doesn't have to be a number, so we'll discover a little bit later on, but it commonly is. The other key word here is quantitative. All right? You have to be able to measure it with a reasonable degree of accuracy. The keyword there, reasonable, but you have to be able to measure it. It can't just be a gut feeling. You can't just go, oh, I don't know, I think that works okay. No, that's not good enough. You have to know exactly what it is. So whatever that thing is that you're measuring, you have to be able to measure it with a reasonable degree of accuracy. And we'll get into some examples of what constitutes reasonable as well a little later on. SLIs are the basis of SLOs, which is the next thing. So it's really key that we get a good hold on this. Now, when I was developing this talk in the before time, this is where I would look out into the audience and try to get a sense of, all right, are people phasing out? Are people nodding their heads? Maybe get a raise of hands. How do we feel about SLIs? Obviously, I can't do that here, right? In this brave new world. So how do we feel about this? I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. Again, the important thing here is that it's an indicator. It's something that you're measuring, and that is telling you something important about the health of your systems, about the health of your services. Now, it could be anything, but it's going to be something, and you have to be able to measure it, and you have to know exactly what it is, and you have to know what that thing is over time, right? That's super important. Okay, so that's SLIs. They're metrics. You have to be able to measure them. You have to be able to track them over time, and you have to know what they are to a reasonable degree of accuracy. I hope everybody's good with that. Okay, we'll move on to the next one, which is SLOs. As I said, SLIs are the basis of SLOs. So service level indicators are the basis of service level objectives, SLOs. A service level objective is a target value for a service. It's measured via an SLI, right? That's the idea. So a service level objective is a target value. It's a number that you pick that you want your SLIs to be at. So when you measure the SLI, you want that SLI to meet, be equivalent to, exceed, whatever you want to do with that SLO. It's an objective, okay? You pick a reasonable value, and that value is what you're trying to maintain, what you're trying to strive for. We'll get into a few examples later on, but the core idea is that an SLO is a target, right? It's a goal. It's something to aim for. It's a, spoiler alert, it's a way of measuring the success or failure of your service over time. Right? And this is to give you an idea with that last little bit of how to sort of pick a good SLI. pick things that are actually going to give you a good idea of what's working and what's not. Maybe a hard disk is filling up somewhere. I mean, who cares? The hard disk is filling up. I mean, do track that, do monitor that, but that doesn't even mean the life or death of your company, right? But some other things, some other numbers that you might want to track are more important than that, or less important than that. And the idea behind an SLO is to pick targets that you're aiming at and go, if I can achieve that target, if the numbers I've chosen for my SLIs meet or exceed or are under or whatever for my objectives, then I'm winning, right? Then I am succeeding. The thing I'm trying to do, I have a clear, concise way of saying, yes, we are going in the right direction. The important thing here is that we're measuring either success or failure, right? So you could exceed a value and that could mean success. You could exceed a value and that could mean failure, but that's what that number is trying to tell you. Winning, not winning. It's the SLO. And again, here, I would look out in the audience, try to get a feel for how we feel about this. Can't do it. So if you have questions, I don't know if there's gonna be time for a Q&A afterwards. I'm certainly open to that, but we will move on to the next one. So again, SLIs, a metric, a number that you're measuring with reasonable degree of accuracy. An SLO is an objective, which you're trying to target for that number. In the same way that SLIs are the basis for SLOs, SLOs are the basis for SLAs. So what's an SLA, right? Logical question. A service level agreement is a contract that defines the results and the consequences of meeting or missing one or more SLOs. And again, the quote there is really important because those words are carefully selected in terms of the definition. So some other ways we might think about an SLA, some other words we might use would be agreement, although it's right in the acronym, so it's a bit redundant. Promise, contract. Okay, these are all words that can be used to talk about SLAs, to describe SLAs. The important thing here is that it's a statement. It's a statement that codifies what happens when an SLO target is missed, right? So we have the SLO, we have the goal we're trying to achieve, and we don't achieve it. It's a thing that happens, right? So what's the result of missing that target? What's the repercussion of missing that target? The SLA defines that, all right? Now, in principle, that result, I mean, it could be anything, right? I mean, you do you. I'm telling you how to do your job or run your business. But commonly, an SLA takes the form of a business decision, right? Or it could be a financial repercussion. For example, we'll say, we want this number to define the uptime of the service. And we have our objective of, say 5 nines. And if we slip on those 5 nines, what happens? Maybe a customer doesn't have to pay us that month, or maybe we have to pay out an indemnity, or maybe some other thing occurs. And we'll go through some examples of what those might be. But again, the idea here to keep in mind is that the SLA is a statement and like a promise you're making around an SLO. And the SLO is made up of the SLIs. So that's the relationship of these 3 acronyms: SLI, SLO, SLA. That's it, right? It's, you lay it out like that and you go, actually, you know what? These acronyms make sense. I could see how one builds on the other. Why did it take me so long to figure this out? It might have taken you so long to figure this out because there's a ton of information out there. There's so many blog posts, there's books written about it, there's certifications, there's marketing material. There's so much stuff people are out there trying to sell around these concepts that the waters get muddied. And at the end of the day, it's actually really straightforward, right? It's a metric, it's a value you'd like to achieve, and it's a repercussion for not achieving it. Boom, done, right? That's it. So there we go. what's important here is that last thing I mentioned, though, which is that an SLA might take the form of a business or financial outcome. And as you might be able to guess from that there's more than just monitoring tools at play, and it's more than just like thinking about computers, right? As practitioners, I work for literally an observability company, so I spend a lot of time staring at metrics. At the end of the day, when we talk about especially SLAs, but also SLOs, we're starting to get away from the everyday of the practitioner, and we're starting to get into a world where more stakeholders are involved, basically, right? It's a team effort when it comes to identifying and scoping and defining and ultimately implementing these things, right? You can't, I shouldn't say can't. I should say that it is a warning sign. If you are a developer of an application and it is your sole responsibility to come up with these things, now you should absolutely be involved in these things, right? You're the developer, you know what's going on, okay? But if you're the only one, that's a warning sign. If the product manager is the only one, that's a warning sign. If the salespeople are the only one, that's a warning sign, all right? It takes a team effort to do these things. So product managers, product owners, developers, SREs, operations people, right? Your customer success people, execs, various levels, various portions of the organization might want to get involved in that. And also that last one I've got right there on the side, which is customers. Your customers are actually the most important part of the equation, the most important stakeholder here, right? You wouldn't be running the service. You wouldn't have a company if you didn't have customers, right? The service would not exist if somebody weren't there to consume it, right? So when we're thinking about what are our important indicators and what are we trying to achieve with those indicators and what are the repercussions for not meeting those objectives, we're really talking about the user, the customer, the consumer, right? Get them involved if you can. And the people who know those customers best are generally speaking, a lot of organizations are going to be product owners, product managers, and your customer support people. So you need those voices in the mix when you're trying to come up with good answers for these questions. But let's actually focus on that last one, which is customers, right? When we talk about these things, SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs, and you're trying to figure out, okay, starting from square one, what am I trying to measure? Start with the customer experience. Start right there, and then work your way back, right? Don't start with hard drives filling up, right? Don't start with the number of nines of uptime. That's a red herring, right? That gives you some interesting information, but it might not actually necessarily tell you anything about the user experience, the customer experience, the consumer experience. So your users could be, again, your customers, they could be consumers. These could be people on the outside of your organization that are, paying you money. They could be people on the inside of your organization that are using the services you're providing. A lot of organizations are into like microservices, right? Or, product teams that like manage a stack within the organization, and that thing they're managing is only used internally. Well, guess what? That thing you're managing that's only used internally, you have customers. Just because they're not on the outside of your organization doesn't mean that they don't have expectations. Doesn't mean that they don't have good and bad experiences with the thing you're providing. So these things aren't just external, they're internal as well, right? And again, I got to drive this home, super important. Focus on the user experience, right? That's what matters. And we're going to get into some examples of that. So if you're like, okay, that's very nice of you to say that, Dan, but like, can you give me a concrete example? The answer is yes, and I will. But you got to wait for it. All right. So let's talk now about quality targets, because this actually is going to help us to define and understand what some of those good examples actually are. So quality targets. We talk about quality targets. Again, we're going right back to user experience. User experience is everything. Okay, so here are some ways to think about actually coming up with and assessing and determining quality targets. Question number one, how are your users actually interacting with your product? How are they doing it, right? Is it through a web browser? Is it through a mobile phone? Is it something they're calling and they're pressing buttons, right? Do you make consoles in cars, built-in GPS? I don't know what it is you do, but how are your users actually interacting with your product? First question, analyze that. And all of a sudden now, right, you're an SRE and you've got to tune your monitoring product for service level indicators. Wait a minute, I got to start with the user. Now you got to go, you got to talk to your front end people. You got to talk to your UI UX people, right? That's where that conversation starts. How are your customers, how are your users actually interacting with your product? What's their workflow look like, right? Do they just click a thing, wait for an answer, and then walk away? I mean, maybe. If it's as simple as that, I mean, awesome. You've developed the world's most simple product. Good for you, right? Especially if it's profitable. Can I get in on an investment round? That sounds great. But probably it's more complicated than that, right? So what does that workflow look like? When they press a button, what happens? When they press a button, do they press another button? Is there an expectation they're going to continue? Step by step by step. Each of those things matters. What services do they interact with over the course of that workflow, right? And again, if it's something real simple, then that answer is going to be real simple. But in our hyper complex world of millions of stacks running in the cloud and frameworks and, serverless this, and you got some stuff still in a data center over there and something's running, on someone's machine, sitting on their desk somewhere for some reason. Like, are you kidding me? You're going to have to take and look at all those different services. Because all of a sudden, that indicator, which might be, oh yeah, we need, when the user clicks on this button, we expect them to get a response in under 1 second. Okay, super. That means that everything that has to happen between the user clicking on that button and them getting a response has to occur in a fraction of a second, right? That's network round trip. That's the database somewhere. That's your CDN, right? That's a lot of different things. All have to be taken into account. It's not just one number. We got to now start an idea that sometimes an indicator, an SLI, which we're making our SLOs around, might not actually be so simple as measuring one thing. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes you're measuring a collection of things and you're expressing them as a single value. And that collection of things can get really complicated really fast. And that's why you need all those stakeholders, because they're the ones who are going to help you to understand that collection. You're going to have to think about what your users want. What do they expect, right? Click on a button, 1 second response time, right? Do they expect that? Is that necessary? As the product owner, maybe you think, oh yeah, it has to be under a second, but maybe they're willing to wait longer than that. How do you know? Again, talk to the stakeholders. They're going to know your product best. Not all values make for good SLIs, and I've touched on a couple of sort of silly examples already, right? And some of them are simple. When we talk about what are crummy SLIs, things like resource utilization, CPU, memory, disk space. These are not good SLIs, except perhaps in the case that you are literally selling compute. Like you're a cloud provider and you're selling compute. So the amount of actual CPU that you can allocate to your users might end up being a good SLI. But I would say most people are not in the compute business. So for most people looking at resources, it's tempting because it's easy. And as a practitioner, I understand it. It's not good enough, generally speaking. I think it's okay. So the numbers need to be more complicated. What's complicated is like quorum state. Right? Quorum state is complicated. I literally talked to anybody who's managed a cluster of 2 or more machines. Quorum state is complicated, but does it really matter? Right? It matters maybe to the SRE or to the database administrator. It doesn't necessarily matter to your customer, right? So even though it's a complicated number that matters to a lot of people inside of your organization, the user does not care. Not a good SLI, right? The number of lines of code per commit, it would be another terrible example, right? Like, oh, our programmers are so productive. They commit 10,000 lines of code a day. Well, actually, one, that's probably a problem. And you should look into that, right? But it's not a good SLI. Your customer doesn't care how many lines of code are committed. So These are some examples of terrible SLIs. So how do we identify good ones? I'm here to tell you, right? Here are some good ones. Now, is this an exhaustive list? Absolutely not. These are just some ideas, right? So let's go through them a little bit. I've got them here broken into a couple of sections. So section number 1 would be responses and requests. Section number 2 would be storage. Remember I said earlier that monitoring your disk space is a bad idea. Okay, so storage. And also pipeline, which is an interesting sort of idea. These are not necessarily official words. These are just ways I like to think about them, right? So when we think about responses and requests, a good example could be availability, right? Is the thing up? Is the service up, right? Can I make a connection to it? TCP handshake, can I do that, right? Can I negotiate on a higher level protocol? Like, do I get an HTTP response? Could the server actually respond, right? So, you know, that's a pretty basic sort of indicator. I would not build my entire business around this, but it's a good place to start, because if your user can't connect to your service, then it doesn't really matter what's happening after that, right? So pretty easy frontline SLI. Also latency. How long did it take for the server to respond to the request would be an example of latency. How long did it take for the CDN to process the request, right? An example of latency. How long did it take for that to get transmitted to the user? What's the round trip on that look like? These are all examples of latency, right? Throughput, how many requests can be handled, how much data can be transmitted. So good examples here. And depending on what you're running, what your users expect, these are good sorts of indicators. Talking about storage, we're talking about availability, right? Can the data be accessed? And much like the availability on the response request, if you can't access the service, nothing else matters. Same thing here. If you literally can't access the database entry, if you literally can't load the image, if that doesn't matter, nothing else matters. The user's looking at their phone, they're looking at their computer, and they're going, this is awful, close, right? Done. Latency, how long does it take to read or write that data, right? Okay, I accessed it really fast. When I tried to update my profile, it took 5 minutes and timed out. That was gross. Okay, that's an indicator. And is the data still there when it's needed? So durability. Now this one is going to hit home for anybody who's ever had to manage block storage, right? Object storage. Durability is super, super important, and oftentimes can make for a good place to start looking for indicators. And finally, pipeline. Pipeline, again, just a way of thinking about it. We talk about correctness. Correctness. Was the correct data returned? So it's all great if the service is up. It took basically no time to access it. I can act a zillion responses a second. It's super available. It's super uptime. I get that data every time I want it, but it's not my data. It's someone else's data. That's a good indicator. And it's not only a good indicator because user experience is involved, also things like, GDPR and legal issues, right? Anything legal, good indicator, right? If you can measure it, that's a good indicator. And freshness, right? How long did it take for that data to be updated, to appear, to be refreshed? This is super critical for CDNs. We talk about this joke, there are only a certain number of hard problems in computer science, naming things, cache invalidation, so on and so forth, right? So cache invalidation, generally speaking, a good indicator. So those are just some good ones. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but this should give you an idea of kind of where to start, right? When we're talking about SLIs and where to start looking for good ones, these are the sorts of things we're talking about. The important thing here is to understand that SLIs are applied values. They're not just numbers. These numbers have an application, and that's actually super, super critical. These indicators must represent user experience. And I know I've said that in a variety of different ways already a few times. I just got to drive that home, right? So here are some examples, right? The number of requests to an endpoint that complete successfully, that represents a user experience thing, right? So that's a good value. Or the number of requests to an endpoint that complete within 500 milliseconds, that would be a good indicator. Now, these sound quite similar, right? But they're technically measuring different things. But also note that they're phrases, right? I can say them out loud. The number of requests to an endpoint that completes successfully. That's a sentence. It has words, it has meaning, it has impact. I can communicate that without having to explain very many other things. It's another sort of way of figuring out, does your SLI make sense? when you're choosing your SLIs, when you're working with the stakeholders, can you describe that SLI in a sentence? If you can't, keep working, right? So we'll keep these two in mind because we're going to continue to work through on them. So the number of requests to an endpoint that complete successfully, okay, that's a good indicator. The number of requests to an endpoint that complete within 500 milliseconds. They're subtly different. Consider that that second one doesn't explicitly state a successful request, right? So the number of requests to the endpoint to complete within 500 milliseconds, okay, it completed, but it was a failure. That technically completed, right? But the user didn't like it. So it's a good indicator, but it's not the only indicator. Got to be able to answer why there. So we should also be looking at success conditions. Success conditions are good indicators, but failure conditions are good indicators also. Don't ignore them. In fact, target them, point straight at them, because those are the ones that sometimes are the most interesting. So in the same way that we're talking about SLIs being applied values, so we've got SLOs are in fact applied SLIs, right? We're building on that. So objectives have both a target and a time window. These two things are super, super critical. Objectives have both a target and a time window. So taking that first example again, we'll say requests are 99.95% successful within the last 24-hour period. Okay, that's not so bad, right? 90% of requests complete under 500 milliseconds in the last 30 days. So we see how these two things are different, right? We talk about SLOs, we're talking about values, we're talking about a number, a single number at a point in time, right? We're talking about SLOs, we're talking about those numbers over a period of time. That's super critical. And another sort of subtlety that tends to get lost in the sea of information around these things, okay? So objectives have both a target and a time window, right? We want to achieve that number, and we want to achieve that number over a space of time. That time's predefined. And although I don't have it here on the slide, another important thing here is that there's a relationship between those targets and those windows, right? If you ever work with a time series database, you'll know that over time, the database becomes less granular, right? So, on a microsecond level, for example, you might have really, really granular numbers, many, many decimal points of accuracy. And then as it slides through 60 seconds, through 5 minutes, through 15 minutes, through an hour, through days, through months, through years, the accuracy decreases over time. SLOs are often like that as well, right? And that's to smooth things out. That's to smooth out the bumps. That's to smooth out little disruptions and things, right? You certainly don't want to be tying your business's success or failures to little lag spikes, right? That's a bad idea. Anybody who's had to purchase bandwidth, is familiar with the idea of, what's your 95th percentile look like, right? That's what we're talking about here, right? Those SLOs, is those values and those targets over time. And there's a relationship, again, between those values and the time upon which you're measuring them. In much the same way that SLOs are applied SLIs, SLAs, agreements, are applied SLOs. So the agreements address expectations and impacts. And I touched on this earlier, so I'll give you a couple of examples. And again, looking at those two. The customer expects a minimum service, the customer expects a given service to have a 0.05% maximum error rate daily, or they'll receive a rebate. That's a good service level agreement, right? It's a statement. It identifies the consumer. It identifies the expectation. And it identifies the impact if the expectation is not met. That's it, right? So if you stay under that maximum error rate daily, the customer's happy. Nothing happens. If you exceed that error rate daily, something happens. Maybe the customer gets some money back. And then again, that second example, the customer expects only 10% of monthly requests to take longer than 500 milliseconds to complete, or they'll be reimbursed for the compute overage, right? So here you're saying it's okay if a certain number of those requests take more than 500 milliseconds to complete. Like, that's going to happen. There's a margin there, but as long as you're within that margin, everyone's happy. And again, the important thing here is all we're saying here is 500 milliseconds to complete. We didn't say it completed successfully. So, be careful with the wording here, right? There's lots of ways to play around with this. So those are sort of two sort of practical examples we've built from the idea of the indicator through the idea of the objective, which again, the time window, through the idea of the agreement, which is managing expectations and impacts of not meeting those expectations. I hope everybody feels good about that. And I'm going to go through some more stuff a little bit later on, but there we go. That's where we're at right now. So that last one I talked about here, that last example of having that margin for error, that 10% margin for error, is the little segue into talking about the next topic, which is error budgets, right? That margin is a margin of error, right? It's a budget, if you will. And the concept of error budgets are not, brand new. There's certainly not even invented by us as computer people, as technologists, right? It's been around for a long time. We just adopted it into our brave new world of computing because we like to think we invented everything. So let's actually talk about error budgets. One of my mottos for a fairly long time has been move fast and fix things. I didn't like the idea of moving fast and breaking things. I guess I'm a little too conservative for that. I like the idea of moving fast and fixing things, because stuff's going to break. It's going to happen anyway. Why do it on purpose? Instead, concentrate on fixing those things, making things better, not worse. Failure is unavoidable, right? It's going to happen. It's how you respond that's important. And when we're talking about SLOs and SLIs and SLAs, we're talking about, to some degree at least, that response, right? You want to have a way of balancing innovation, right? You want to have a way of balancing, okay, we're going to break stuff, and that's cool, with let's not break things because our customers will get angry. What is that balance? Right? I want to innovate. I want to push limits. I want to test new things. I want to put out new products. I want to excite and delight my customers, to use a marketing term. And in doing so, maybe I'm going to break something. Maybe something's going to stop working. Maybe something is not going to have the same expectation or user experience as it did before. And that might make some people happy and might make some people unhappy, right? So how do you balance that? So an error budget's similar to an SLA. Right, this idea of an SLA is very similar to an error budget, in that it codifies that balance. It codifies, okay, we're breaking things. How much can we break before we have to start fixing things? And then once we fix enough things, when do we get to start breaking things again? Right? That's the error budget. So how do we build one? You start with an SLO. And that's why we started talking about that before this. Right? You start with an SLO. The SLO is generally defined by the product owner in this case. Now, this is a little bit different from sort of the global idea of SLOs, is everybody's got skin in the game, and this can also be true here. But generally speaking, in most organizations, especially product, organized organizations, okay, the SLO is defined by the product owner. So they come with this objective. They say, we've got this target that we want to meet, and if we can meet it, then we're allowed to break things. And if we don't meet it, then we're not allowed to break things. And the product owner defines that. Okay, cool. The actual objective, that thing we're measuring, is measured by a neutral party. And this is actually super important. You can't just put your finger in the air. I don't know, I guess we met it. It feels good. Incorrect, right? And you can't allow the product team to measure it. Okay, not that we don't trust these people, but there's a reason here why you allow a neutral party, a neutral third party, to measure it. Then this is done by a monitoring system, so it's automated. Now it could be something like a product that you're paying for on the outside. It could be something that you built internally that's managed by another team, not your team. Okay, but the point is it has to be not you that's measuring it. It has to be something else. And the reason is because, again, here you're measuring experience, you're measuring impact. And if you're on the inside, you get that tunnel vision, maybe you don't see what the impact is. That impact can only be seen from the outside, can only be understood from the outside. So it also has to be measured from the outside. The difference between the actual measurement, right? So the thing that got measured and the objective you set, that's your error budget, right? So if you set your objective here and you say, oh, we're making error, that space in between, that's your error budget. Those are the things you can break before you have to stop breaking things. And I'm kind of using funny language here, so I'll give you some examples, right? How do you use that budget? There's two ways. You can either spend the budget or you can build the budget, which should sound familiar to anybody who's ever dealt with, money before, kind of ever, right? You can spend the budget. So if your SLO is being met, whatever that means, you could be under a number, you could be over a number, you could be exactly on the number, whatever that objective means, if you're meeting it, you have room to move, you have room to be agile, you have room to maneuver and innovate, right? Add a new feature, add 4 new features, deploy a new version, deploy 9 new versions, do some planned downtime to, do a database migration. Like whatever you need to do that's going to result in that indicator shifting, slipping, ducking and weaving, right? That's your space to do it. But then when that agreement, that SLA gets hit, right? What happens? You have to codify that. And that's when you enter the build phase, where you go, okay, we've expended our budget. We did the things, we slipped, and now we have to rebuild. If your budget's 0 or it's negative, concentrate on that. Feature freeze. No more new features. It doesn't matter what the customer wants. Doesn't matter what the product owner wants. Stop. Stop and fix problems. Okay? Improve the observability story, because maybe your observability story is garbage, right? Work on that, right? Prioritize dealing with technical debt. Like, this is your time to do it. And the nice part about it is it's irreproachable, right? If you have this, if you put this in place, you put these structures in place and everybody agrees to these structures and you hit these numbers and they're quantitative numbers and the computer says no, then you have an unassailable argument to finally start working on technical debt. And that's a powerful idea, right? Powerful. So that's the idea behind an error budget, right? Is it's like an SLA for your team. It's an SLA for you. And it gives you an idea of how quickly you can move. And then when you need to slow down to fix things, then you can quickly move again, which is really, really cool, right? Okay, so let's go through some practical examples. So for the practical examples, we're going to take an imaginary site called photosite.net. It's fun and also critically not real. There are so many top-level domains now that picking one that's fake is basically impossible. So I picked one using a character that I'm pretty sure doesn't exist, the eth character. So photosite.net is a fun site for uploading, sharing, and viewing photos, right? I don't know, Flickr, Instagram, but whatever, pick your poison. You can friend people. You can be part of groups of communities. You can buy print quality photos. You can download photos, upload photos. You can sell your photos. So it's sort of a photo site, right? Photosite.net. Okay, cool. Just picture what this might be in your mind and all the things that might go into such a site, right? There's going to be a web front end. There's going to be this databases. There's storage somewhere. There's probably 9 different JavaScript frameworks involved. Like whatever it is that makes the site go, start imagining that, in your head. And we're all technical people. We can start to get a feeling for what this might involve. So we start with the user experience. How are our users interacting with that product, right? And so they're clicking around, they're viewing photos, they're doing searches for photos, maybe, right? So what are they searching for? File names, tags, descriptions. Okay, that's the user experience. That's how they're interacting with it. Maybe through their website, maybe on their phones. This is what it feels like. What's in that workflow to get to the point where they can actually interact with your site, right? They got to be able to log in, maybe. Maybe there's an anonymous mode. There's probably a login mode, especially if you're accepting payments and uploading photos and stuff. So you gotta be able to log in. You gotta be able to search as a functionality, not just a practice. They have to be able to view photos, right? Sort of the point onto the photo site. They have to be able to download photos. I mentioned maybe they want to buy photos and stuff as well, right? So this is different from actually thinking about interacting with it. Interacting is what are they doing? The workflow is what do they have to do those things, right? The user didn't come to your site to log in. That's just a thing they had to do. The user didn't come to your site to search. Searching's not fun. We don't do it for good times, right? Because we do it because we want to find something, right? What services do those users interact with? Your customers, right? And again, this is not an exhaustive list, right? They're going to probably be interacting with an accounts backend of some type, like a database, right? An auth service. of some type, right? I mean, they're passing a token around. Who knows what that looks like? They're going to be interacting with an upload service, some sort of block storage. Again, who knows what that looks like, right? Now, there's a zillion other things, that other types of back-end services that they're going to be interacting with, that they don't care what's there or not, but they do need to exist. They need to be up. Those things need to be considered. And what do your users actually want, right? We ought to actually address that. What do they expect when they're clicking and viewing and searching and logging in and downloading and paying for things? Well, they probably want it to be fast. I mean, they probably want a lot of things, right? Users are very demanding, but this is an example of a thing they want. So these 4 questions are the 4 questions you need to ask when you start to think about the user experience. How are they interacting with it? What is their workflow? What services do they interact with? And what do they want? What are their expectations, right? So looking back to our list of indicators, remember we're talking about response requests, storage, and then pipeline indicators. Let's go through some examples here, right? Availability, could the server respond to the request? All of a sudden now that makes sense, right? Photo site, oh yeah, we have that in our head now. How many requests can we handle? Can the data be accessed on demand? What does the latency there look like? And if it seemed a little bit abstract before, maybe now it feels a little bit more concrete, because now we're thinking about, okay, like an actual web service, right? These questions now we can start to imagine in our heads what the impact of them are. Was the correct data return? This could be really important. If I search for cats and I get dogs, that's not going to be a great user experience, although it could be hilarious. So you do you, right? How long does it take for the new data or processed rights, right? So I upload a picture, how long before someone can pay for that picture and print it off or whatever, right? So all of a sudden, a bit more concrete, right? Super quick, because, I realized I said we're going to talk for half an hour and already 46 minutes in. So I'm going to leave you with a couple more quick tips, all right, before we wrap it up. I do work for an observability company. I've tried not to mention it too much, but I will mention this. This is the kind of the one slide, right? Is that we do a lot of measuring SLIs, as you might imagine, at Datadog. And we think about them in 2 different ways. We think about them as being monitor-based or as being event-based. And so when we talk about monitor-based SLIs, we're basing them on the idea of monitors, right? Which are generally tied to metrics. So these are things that you're monitoring. If you have a monitoring system like Nagios or whatever, right? So it's a number you're looking at that's a monitor-based metric, right? So their values within a set time frame. For example, 99% of the time, latency for the request is less than 200 milliseconds, which is one that we looked at earlier. But there's also event-based requests, which is a different way of thinking about indicators. Now, I mentioned at the very start, one of the very first slides, I said that indicators, SLIs, are generally metrics. Generally, which implies the existence of a non-metric indicator, right? So event-based indicators, or SLIs, are based on events, which are more akin to statements. They're more like a success ratio, than they are a specific number. For example, 99% of requests have a latency less than 200 milliseconds, which is subtly different, right? Than 99% of the time latency for this request is less than 200 milliseconds. One is based on, again, a number, and the other is based on an amalgamation of factors, right? So it's a subtle difference there, which is, and again, it's the idea of a ratio, right? Working, not working, how much of it? It's interesting. Okay, cool. If you have been in the ops game for long, you've probably heard of the 4 golden signals. No matter what you do, you can't avoid them, right? So when we talk about indicators, talk about the 4 golden signals. We talked about them to death here today. So don't ignore them. Bring them up. Educate your product owners. Educate your salespeople. Educate your developers. Educate your fellow SREs about the 4 golden signals, because the 4 golden signals are the basis for most good SLIs that you're going to be able to come up with off the top of your head. And always, of course, focus on your users, right? Step back from the internals. Especially like when I'm developing, I tend to really I get into the code, I get into the product, and I focus on my IDE, and I can't really think about what's going on around me. And that's fine when I'm developing, but it's not fine when my user's having a bad time, right? You have to step back from the internals. You have to define your user stories, your journeys, and then your SLIs. You can't just pick them out of the air because you think they're an important number. That's irrelevant. What's important is if your user thinks it's an important number. So you have to know what their story is first. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, get all your stakeholders involved, especially your product people, because your product people are the ones that know your users the best. Hopefully, if your product people don't know your users the best out of your entire organization, then that's another problem you're going to need to address, and that's out of scope for this presentation. Finally, if you've never done this before and you don't know where to start small, right? Don't shoot for the moon first, because you're not going to be happy with that result, okay? You've heard the phrase, shoot for the moon, because if you fail, you'll still be in the stars. It's garbage, all right? Shoot for like a meter in front of you, okay? And if you can do that, shoot for 2 meters. And if you can do that, then keep going. That's how the space program was built, okay? They didn't attempt to go to the moon first. They attempted to figure out what gravity was, okay? So start small. Not that gravity is that small, but okay. Yeah, baby steps. So gain that experience, experiment by hand if you have to, right? Run Apache Bench against a thing and see what happens, right? Build out data sets to establish reasonable baselines. Do that first, right? Do that so you know what your systems are capable of handling before you unleash users onto them. Go through beta tests and go through, closed groups and so on and so forth. Err on the side of naivete. I hope that's a word in English. Sorry, I'm French. Err on the side of naivete, because you want to choose a naive metric and be wrong about it, rather than choose a really complicated one and be wrong about it. Because a really simple metric you're wrong about is simple to diagnose, it's simple to reason about, and crucially simple to replace, right? A really complicated indicator that you're wrong about is going to take you a very long time to unravel. And maybe you never will. Maybe it will just always be subtly wrong. And that sucks, right? So start small. Also consider that SLOs can change. These are not engraved onto stone tablets, handed down on a mountaintop, right? These are a part and parcel of your business. They're part and parcel of your organization. Every organization changes. Things move quick, right? So your indicators are going to change. Your objectives are going to change. Reevaluate them over time as your environment evolves, as your business evolves, and also your SLAs, right? If your indicators are changing and your objectives are changing, then your agreements have to change too. Those can be a little bit more difficult, especially if they're built into legal contracts and things, which is where you need to get good legal people involved to put wording around that. But, these things are modifiable, and that's super important. They're not dogmatic. They're really important, and they can help you and your business do better and be better, but they're not universal truths. Quite the opposite, in fact, and that's super important. Also, I should point out that tooling matters. Now, again, I work for an observability company. I'm going to tell you to use Datadog, but you use whatever you want to use. Use tooling that gives you insight into this stuff. If your observability tooling can't help you figure out your SLIs, can't help you measure your SLOs, can't give you different ways to reason about them, can't give you different ways to build them, can't give you different visualizations to allow you to explain them to different stakeholders. If your tooling can't do these things, you need different tooling. And there are options out there. I'll be happy to talk to you about one of them in particular. But the point is the tooling does matter for this particular purpose. It really does. And I think that's it. So I hope you enjoyed that. Normally, this is where I would be hearing clapping. I'm hoping you're at home clapping right now.
Amazing, man. Amazing. It was amazing. Congrats, man. Congrats.
Thank you.
And you enjoy to talk here?
Yes. Yeah, it was fun. It's very strange talking in my apartment. It's really weird.
Yeah, I can imagine it. Oh, yeah. Great, man. It was amazing. Thank you so much for your availability to be here today, Friday at night. I know that it's not easy. And yeah, I'm sure that all loved your presentation like me. It's amazing. Congrats, buddy. And I hope that you return more times to talk to us. I really,
for sure.
really appreciate it, man.
Well, thank you again for having me on. I will continue taking my Portuguese lessons, and maybe next year we'll see.
Nice, man. The people like too much. So good.
Yeah.
So,
I see you got the little claps on there. That's really nice. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to come out and maybe do another chat another time.
Yeah, for sure.
Igor had a good question there. Does it make sense to have an SLI without SLOs? I mean, yes, but why? Right? Like, if it's an SLI, if it's important enough to measure that it has an impact on your organization, it's important enough to have a target objective, right? Like, if that number is not important, it's not an indicator, it's just a number, right? If that number is important, then it has an objective, kind of by definition. So you can't have an SLO without an SLI. And the inverse is, if one is functionally true, the other is philosophically so, right? You can't have, there's no point in having an SLI without an SLO. It's just a number.
Yeah, good point. Oh, look, Igor again. I even heard my whole life about SLA, but never stopped to think about the basis. It changed completely what I thinking about. It's nice.
Oh, right on.
Nice.
Right on.
Another one. Who do you think that should establish success metrics? We usually see it top-down decision. And
yeah. So that's a super important question. Important enough for me to take a little drink of water. Who should establish it? Well, I mentioned this actually a little earlier. Is that it's kind of a team effort for value of team, right? In the context of, say, for example, an error budget, which I discussed, which is an implementation of an SLA, it's generally the product owner who's going to do that. But the product owner is then going to look to their team to figure that number out, because that's what product owner does, right? A product owner is going to look to their customers. A product owner is going to look to their developers. Product owner is going to look to their operations people. Product owner is going to look to their manager, right? Could be a VP of product, okay? To try to figure out what that number is. So is it the product owner that establishes that number? Yes. Does the product owner do that in a vacuum? Well, maybe, and that's a problem. Ideally, they're not. Ideally, they're gathering all that data because that's literally their job, right? To come up with that value. If it's top down, if someone 9 levels ahead of you in another country that's never actually used your service is making that decision, that's probably a mistake, right? If someone like, somebody within your organization, like a random developer somewhere has just been tasked with coming up with these numbers, that's probably also a mistake, right? You need people who have the expertise in that service, in that product, in that stack. Not necessarily, although certainly could be technical, but really what you're looking for is someone who can go and gather that data and can bring objectivity and I'm looking for the word in English. They can be trusted to come up with that value. Yeah.
Nice one. So the last one is not a question. Is so I'm working to the process to add SLI as part of new features that we may add to the product. This is a great time to have UX engineer part of the DevOps cycle. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is. So that's yes. The answer is yes. DevOps, I didn't mention it at all in this talk, but I've been into the whole DevOps scene for a little while now, and yes, this is an excellent time to have to bring UX engineers in. The nice part about it is it's natural, and one of the, I don't want to say problems, but one of the criticisms and difficulties with people attempting to implement DevOps practices in their organizations is that it's easy to bring developers and operations people sort of into the fold, right? But sometimes it can be difficult to figure out, how do we bring not those people into the conversation? How can we bring front-end people in the conversation? How can we bring UX people in the conversation? How can we bring sales people into the conversation? How can we bring product people? How can we bring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And this discussion around SLIs and ultimately SLAs is a very natural way to bring those different actors into the DevOps discussion. So yeah, solid.
Nice. And look, Somatorio, then that invite to come to Porto Alegre is still up for the next year.
With great pleasure. With great pleasure. I would very much like to come. I read an article about a year ago that said that the food scene in Porto Alegre was excellent, and I am a foodie, so I would really like to check that out.
Good.
Okay.
Man, thank you again. For sure, we really appreciate your talk, your presentation. It's fantastic. So I have a slogan here. Always when I finish a video, that is vai, right? It's like go in English. Could you finish this video saying vai? It's like vai. It's like go.
Okay.
Could you?
Oh, vai!
Sensacional. Thanks so much, man. Awesome. Thank you again and have a great weekend, bro. Pessoal, muito obrigado. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Olha só, excelente talk aqui com o Dan lá da Datadog. Muito legal mesmo. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado para todo mundo que esteve aqui presente durante esse talk. And again, thank you, Dan. It's amazing. Thank you, man.
Thank
bye,
you.
Bye.
Obrigado. Au revoir. Ciao.
Vai.
Merci bien.